The Unseen CEO. Elijah Daniels had come a long way from the broken streets where he grew up. His path to success hadn't been easy, but it had been driven by a relentless desire to prove that someone like him, black, from humble beginnings, could build something meaningful. He'd spent years working in corporate spaces where he was often the only person of color in the room. He'd learned how to speak the language of power and influence, but he'd also seen the toll it took on those who didn't fit the mold. When he founded Franklin Market, he made a promise to himself that it would be different. His stores would be a place of respect, empowerment, and community. But now, standing in the dimly lit back room of one of his stores, disguised as a janitor, he wondered if his vision had been lost somewhere along the way. He had received several complaints from customers and employees alike about the atmosphere at this particular location, but none of them prepared him for what he was about to hear. The store was supposed to reflect the values he had instilled in his business: fairness, respect, and collaboration. Instead, it felt like a pressure cooker, with tensions building up at every corner. Elijah watched as the employees interacted with one another, or rather, avoided each other. There was no camaraderie, no sense of team. His eyes narrowed as he began to listen carefully. The first thing that struck him was the disdain with which the employees spoke about their work. A cashier complained about the manager, Brent, who never acknowledged her efforts or gave her the proper training to handle difficult customers. She confided in her coworker that Brent would often pass over her when scheduling shifts, giving her the worst hours while offering prime-time slots to others who weren't as dedicated. Elijah could feel the frustration in her voice, the subtle sting of being overlooked. He had always prided himself on recognizing the worth of every single employee, no matter their role. But here, at his own store, his employees were treated like cogs in a machine, easily replaced and never valued. As Elijah moved through the store, he overheard a conversation between two staff members. One of them, a young woman named Rachel, had made a small mistake during the lunch rush, a mistake that any reasonable manager would have brushed off. Instead, she was reprimanded in front of the entire team, humiliated for a simple slip-up. The other employees whispered behind her back, mocking her every move. Elijah felt a pang in his chest. This wasn't the environment he had envisioned when he first opened Franklin Market. This was a place of fear, not respect. And the deeper he listened, the more he realized how much damage had been done. But what truly shocked him came when he overheard a conversation between Brent and another manager. They were discussing the store's budget, but what should have been a straightforward discussion quickly turned into a conversation about cutting corners. Brent mentioned how he had been skimming money from the store's petty cash fund and diverting some of the funds to his own pocket. Elijah's blood ran cold. This was his store, his business, and yet here was one of his most trusted managers betraying him in such a blatant, corrupt way. The anger that had been simmering inside him exploded. But instead of reacting immediately, he stayed calm, choosing to let the moment play out. The hidden betrayal. As the day went on, Elijah continued to observe, unnoticed, as the cracks in his company grew more apparent. He watched as a delivery driver, who had worked at Franklin Market for years, was berated by a new supervisor for arriving late, despite the fact that the driver had been working overtime without complaint. The supervisor's words were harsh, his tone demeaning, as he scolded the older man in front of everyone. Elijah could see the shame on the delivery driver's face, his shoulders slumped, his pride chipped away with every cutting word. This wasn't leadership. This was cruelty disguised as authority. Elijah had worked tirelessly to create an environment where employees were treated with dignity and respect. But here, that mission had been forgotten, overshadowed by managers like Brent who used their power to control rather than inspire. By the time Elijah made his way to the break room, he was no longer surprised by what he was hearing. Employees gathered around, chatting in hushed tones about the latest issues in the store. What struck him the most was their sense of hopelessness. They had accepted the toxic culture as normal. It was clear that Brent had managed to manipulate the staff into believing that this was all they deserved. No one had the courage to speak up, to challenge the unfair treatment, because they were afraid of the consequences. Elijah understood that fear. He had seen it firsthand when he was growing up, in schools and neighborhoods where standing out was dangerous. But he had never allowed fear to dictate his path, and he wouldn't allow it to rule his business either. Then, the final straw came. Elijah overheard a conversation between Rachel and a few others. She had been dealing with chronic pain, a condition that had made it difficult for her to work long hours. She quietly confided in a coworker that she had been asking for medical leave for months, but Brent had ignored her requests, telling her that her problems were not his concern. The frustration and defeat in her voice were palpable. She had already been made to feel like a burden, her struggles dismissed by the very person who should have been her support. Elijah's heart ached as he realized just how deep the rot had set in. His employees had been neglected, mistreated, and taken for granted. And all the while, the man who had the power to fix it, Brent, was using his position to exploit and oppress them. Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew it was time to reveal who he really was. He couldn't let this continue. Not on his watch. The reckoning. Elijah gathered his courage and walked into the main office, where Brent was sitting, going over the store's records. He could hear the manager's voice before he even entered the room, smooth, self-assured, as if he owned the place. Elijah knocked on the door, and when Brent looked up, his expression faltered for a split second. "I've been hearing a lot of things around here," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's time we had a little chat about how things are being run." Brent smirked, clearly not recognizing the man standing before him. "I don't know what you're talking about, but if you have complaints, I'm sure I can take care of them. I run this store. Everything's under control." Elijah smiled, his heart pounding in his chest as he revealed his true identity. "Actually, Brent, you don't run this store. I do. I'm Elijah Daniels, the CEO of Franklin Market." The color drained from Brent's face. The shock was evident, but Elijah wasn't finished. "You've been exploiting my staff, manipulating them, and stealing from the company. And it ends now." The reckoning continued. Brent's eyes widened in disbelief. He stammered, trying to regain his composure, but the confidence he had once exuded was nowhere to be found. I don't know what you mean." "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice shaky as he stood up from his chair. "You must be mistaken. This is crazy." Elijah's eyes remained steady, unwavering. He took a slow step toward the desk, his presence commanding. "I've been working undercover in this store for the past few weeks, listening to your employees, watching how you run things. What I've heard is nothing short of appalling." Elijah paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. Brent opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, but the words wouldn't come. His face had turned pale, his arrogance replaced by a look of fear. Elijah continued, not giving him a chance to interrupt. "I've seen how you've mistreated your team, how you've disrespected them, belittled them, and stolen from this company. You've turned what should have been a place of respect and empowerment into a toxic environment where people are afraid to speak up. People are scared to come to work because of you. That's not the kind of company I've built, and it's not the kind of culture I'm going to allow to thrive." Brent's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. Elijah's words were a wall, and the truth was staring him in the face. "I don't know what you thought you were doing, Brent," Elijah continued, his tone cold now. "But I'll tell you this, your actions have consequences. I've already called the board, and we'll be having a meeting this afternoon to address your conduct. I'm terminating your position effective immediately. You're no longer welcome here." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. For a moment, it seemed like Brent might argue, but then he slumped, defeated, his shoulders falling as if the weight of his lies had finally caught up with him. "Please," he whispered, almost pleading. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." Elijah stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "It's too late for apologies, Brent. You had the chance to do the right thing. But you chose greed and power over people. Now, you'll face the consequences. He turned to leave, but just before exiting the office, he paused and looked back at Brent, who stood frozen behind his desk. You might have thought you were in control, Elijah said softly, but the real power lies in how we treat others. And that's something you'll never understand. The awakening. Elijah walked out of the office, and as he passed by the employees working in the store, he saw them watching him with a mix of curiosity and caution. His revelation had sent ripples through the staff, but Elijah didn't need to say anything more. He had already made his point. The truth was out, and the employees knew they weren't alone anymore. They weren't invisible. He walked over to Rachel, the young woman who had been humiliated earlier. She was standing by the register, nervously adjusting the display of products as if trying to busy herself. Elijah approached her quietly. "Rachel," he said gently, and she looked up, her face a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "I want you to know that I heard everything. What happened today, and everything you've been going through, it won't be ignored. We're going to make things right here." Rachel blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek. "But I didn't think anyone cared. It's like we're just supposed to take it, you know. No one listens to us." Elijah's heart ached, but he nodded, his voice steady. "I'm listening. I'm here now, and I'm going to make sure your voice, and every voice in this store, is heard." Rachel hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Thank you, Elijah." As Elijah continued through the store, he could see the subtle shift in energy. Employees were still cautious, still unsure of what this new revelation meant for them. But there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes, hope that things could change, that they no longer had to endure the toxic culture they had been living in. Elijah made his way to the front of the store, where he stopped and looked out over the bustling aisles. He could see the potential in his business. He could see it in the employees who had been disregarded for far too long. It was time to rebuild. Time to restore what had been broken. Time to reignite the values that had made Franklin Market more than just a business. It was a community, a place where people came not just for groceries, but for dignity, respect, and the sense of belonging that Elijah had always wanted to create. With Brent gone, Elijah knew it wouldn't be easy. There were deep wounds to heal. But the first step had been taken. He had drawn the line. Now, it was time to rebuild trust, to restore faith, and to ensure that Franklin Market would always stand as a beacon of fairness, integrity, and respect. The change. Weeks passed, and the transformation at Franklin Market began to take shape. Elijah worked closely with the remaining managers, ensuring they understood the new values he was instilling. Values that prioritized respect for the employees, fair treatment, and a focus on building a supportive, inclusive environment. He held regular meetings with staff to check in, listen to their concerns, and offer support where needed. The change wasn't instant. There were bumps along the way, and it took time for employees to trust that this wasn't just another corporate promise that would fade over time. But gradually, as Elijah showed up for them, as he held others accountable, the culture began to shift. Staff morale improved, and customers began noticing the difference, praising the positive atmosphere that now permeated the store. Elijah's vision for Franklin Market had been clouded for a time, overshadowed by greed and manipulation. But now, with the right people in charge, Elijah could see his company fulfilling its true potential, not just as a business, but as a force for good. And as he looked over the bustling aisles one last time, he knew that this was just the beginning. The work wasn't done. But he was ready.